Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Chamunatira Vanachari Chamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Jaya Gopi Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Chamunatira Vanachari Chamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Chamunatira Vanachari Chamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Radha Madhava Radhe Jaya Radha Madhava Radha Madhava Radhe Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Srila Prabhupada ki, Srila Satchidananda Thakur Bhakti Vinod ki, Srila Gadadhar Pandit ki, Jai Guru Premananda. So, I'll not read from that.
Sorry?
Shall I read from the literature as well, or shall I just read from the
Both.
Okay.
So Gadadhar was somewhere else, so he's not here.
Sorry?
Gadadhar was mentioned in other place in this book, so
Okay.
he's not here. We will not have time to find it now.
Okay, no problem. Jai. So today is the disappearance day of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So I'm just going to read a short summary of his life and work. Srila Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur appeared in 1838 in a wealthy family in the Nadia district of West Bengal. He was born in the ancient village of Birnagar, Gurugram, as Kedarnath Dutt, the third son of Ananda Chandra Dutt and Jagat Mohini Devi. Among his forefathers was Raja Krishnananda Dutt, the father of the great Vaishnavacharya Narottam Das Thakur, and a great devotee of Lord Nityananda. Living as a Mahabhagavad Vaishnava, he stayed in the Grihastha ashram until the last few years of his life. Then he renounced everything, accepted Babaji, and entered Samadhi, totally absorbed in the loving service of Gaura Gadadhar and Radha Madhava. He had a responsible government position as the district magistrate, high court judge, and maintained a Krishna conscious family and wrote almost 100 books on Krishna consciousness. At the same time, he served the Supreme Lord in so many ways. That is the beauty of his life. After a full day of government service, he would sleep for 4 hours, get up and write until morning. That was his daily program. Bhaktivinoda Thakur took Vaishnav Diksha from Sri Vipin Bihari Goswami in the line of Janavamata. Afterwards, he received spiritual inspiration and direction from Srila Jagannath Das Babaji. Holding an exalted government position, vast erudition and spiritual accomplishments never disturbed Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He remained prideless, always humble and meek, friendly to all. Charity seekers at his home always left happy and satisfied. A well-wisher to everyone, he never kept grudges, even with opponents to his preaching. In fact, he never spoke a word that would hurt another's feelings. Always anxious to use every moment in the loving service of Krishna, he followed the strict, austere daily schedule. Taking rest at 8:10 p.m., rising at 10. It says here rising at 10, but we've just previously read that he took rest for 4 hours. Anyway, rising and then writing from midnight till 4 a.m., taking half an hour rest, 4 a.m., chanting japa from 4:30 to 7, writing correspondence from 7 a.m. to 7:30, studying Shastra from 7:30 to 9:30, taking bodily maintenance and prasadam from 9:30 till 10, attending court duties until 1 p.m., from 1 to 2, taking a break at home, and then returning to court duties from 2 to 5 p.m. From 5 to 7, translating Sanskrit Shastras into Bengali, and from 7 to 8 p.m., taking bath and prasadam, which was actually his prasadam both in the morning and in the evening, with half a litre of milk. In the morning, it was half a litre of milk, some fruit, and 2 chapatis. And in the evening, it was half a litre of milk, rice, and 2 chapatis. Biographers list 3 major preaching achievements of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who is known as the 7th Goswami. 1. He wrote 100 authorized spiritual books. 2. He discovered the appearance place of Lord Chaitanya. And 3. He introduced preaching innovations. Sri Krishna Sanghita Kalyana Kalpataru Sri Chaitanya Shikshamrita Sri Navadvip Dharma Mahatmyam Jaiva Dharma Sri Harinam Chintamani Bhajana Rahasya Gita Mala Gitavali Sharanagati and commentaries on Bhagavad Gita and Chaitanya Charitamrita are some of his major works. In 1888, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur revealed the birthplace, Janmastan, of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at the Yoga Pit in Sridham, Mayapur. Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj, a famous Siddha saint and Paramahansa Rasika Vaishnava, confirmed the Thakur's discovery. This most auspicious event delighted the Gaudiya Vaishnavas from Gauromandal to Rajabhumi. He established the worship of Lord Gauranga and Srimati Vishnupriya at the Yoga Pit. In 1896, the year Srila Prabhupada was born, Bhaktivinoda Thakur sent to universities around the world a book of shlokas, Sri Gauranga Leela Smarana, which had a 40-page English introduction, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, his life and precepts. This act rose from a keen desire to spread Lord Chaitanya's teachings in the Western countries. Bhaktivinoda Thakur made 3 very significant predictions. 1. A personality will soon appear and he will travel all over the world to spread the teachings of Lord Chaitanya. 2. Very soon the chanting of Harinam Sankirtan will be spread all over the world. He said, "Oh, when will that day come when people from America, England, France, Germany, and Russia will take up kartals and mridangas and chant Hare Krishna in their towns?" And 3. When will that day come when the fair-skinned foreigners will come to Sridham, Mayapur, and join with the Bengali Vaishnavas to chant Jaya Satchinandana, Jaya Satchinandana? When will that day be? In 1914, on the disappearance day of Sri Gadadhar Pandit, Bhaktivinoda Thakur left this world and entered the eternal pastimes of Gaura Gadadhara and Radha Madhava. In Godrumadweep, Navadweep, Shri Shri Gaura Gadadhara, the worshipable deities of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, await to bless any visitors to Swananda Sukhata Kunj. In Radha Madhava's Nitya Vraj Leela, Bhaktivinoda Thakur takes the form of Kamala Manjari to serve Srimati Radharani. His Pushpa Samadhi is in his Bhajan Kutir at Radha Kund. Shri Satchidananda Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki.
Just read 1 or 2 paragraphs.
Sorry?
Just read 1 or 2 paragraphs from Lilamrita.
Okay. Reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, chant Hare Krishna and fight. Giriraj Prabhu arranged that one of the newly elected Janata Party members of Parliament come and see Srila Prabhupada. The gentleman, Mr. Ratan Singh Rajda, was eager to meet the leader of the Hare Krishna movement. So while Mr. Rajda had been attending a political rally at Shivji Park, Giriraj had come to arrange the meeting. When I went there, Giriraj told Prabhupada later, he asked me to sit with him on a dais, so I did. But was that wrong? Why not, said Prabhupada, he is honoring you. Giriraj said that Mr. Rajda had asked to be the first speaker at the rally so that he could be free to come and meet with Srila Prabhupada before leaving the next day for a meeting with the central government in Delhi. Giriraj explained that Mr. Rajda was a member of parliament from Bombay South, which was the most prestigious district, and that he had formerly helped ISKCON in their case against the attempted demolition of the temple. Mr. Rajda entered the room and made a respectful gesture of obeisance to Srila Prabhupada. He said he had met Srila Prabhupada once, but since then he had been in jail for 19 months. Srila Prabhupada seemed surprised. Jail, he asked? Mr. Rajda explained that he had been jailed during Indira Gandhi's political emergency. More than 150,000 patriotic people had been imprisoned, he said, including J.K. Prakash and the present Prime Minister Morarji Desai. Okay, we'll stop there. It's a long pastime. Unless you want me to continue, because it's not really, Srila Prabhupada hasn't said anything. Sorry? Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 14, chapter entitled The Forest of Enjoyment. Text 8. Atta Kadachin Nivasa Paniya Travanadi Aneka Atmopajivana Abhinivesh Etasyam Sangsaratavyam Itas Tata Paridavati. Okay, it's a prose verse, so I'll just read it myself. Ata kadachin nivasa paniya travanadhyanekatmo pajivana binivesha etasyam sangsaratavyam itastata paridavati. Please repeat. Ata, in this way, kadachit, sometimes, nivasa, residence, paniya, water, dravina, wealth, adi, and so on, aneka, in various items, atma upajivana, which are considered necessary to maintain body and soul together. Abhinivesha, a person fully absorbed. Etasyam, in this. Sangsara atavyam, the material world, which is like a great forest. Ita tata, here and there. Paridavati, runs around. Translation. Sometimes the conditioned soul is absorbed in finding residential quarters or apartments and getting a supply of water and riches to maintain his body. Absorbed in acquiring a variety of necessities, he forgets everything and perpetually runs around the forest of material existence. Please repeat. Sometimes the conditioned soul is absorbed in finding residential quarters or apartments and getting a supply of water and riches to maintain his body. Absorbed in acquiring a variety of necessities, he forgets everything and perpetually runs around the forest of material existence. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki. As originally mentioned, a poor man belonging to the mercantile community goes to the forest to get some cheap goods to bring back to the city to sell at a profit. He is so absorbed in the thought of maintaining body and soul together that he forgets his original relationship with Krishna and seeks only the bodily comforts. Thus, material activities are the conditioned soul's only engagement. Not knowing the aim of life, the materialist perpetually wanders in material existence, struggling to get the necessities of life. Not understanding the aim of life, even though he acquires sufficient necessities, he manufactures artificial necessities and thus becomes more and more entangled. He creates a mental situation whereby he needs greater and greater comforts. The materialist does not know the secret of nature's ways. As confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 3.27, Prakrite kriyamanani gunai karmani savasha ahankara vimudatma kataham iti manyate. Bewildered spirit soul, under the influence of the three modes of material nature, thinks himself to be the doer of activities which are in actuality carried out by nature. Due to lusty desire, the living entity creates a certain mental situation whereby he wants to enjoy this material world. That he thus becomes entangled, enters different bodies, and suffers in them. Omegyanatimirandasya gananjana shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam yena Bhutale Swayam Rupakadamayam Tadati Swapatantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Uttabarakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Scha Shri Rupam Sagradatam Sahagana Raganatanvitam Tam Sujivam Sarvetam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shiva Shakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sutta Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripasindhubhyevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Radhara Shivasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you. No, thank you. So, a so-called modern materialistic business person reading this passage or this chapter may consider that, oh, this is like talking about some ancient, primitive merchant, who goes to the forest to get some cheap goods to bring back to the city. It's talking about some ancient city where people just had very few of today's technological miracles. People had to go on long long journeys in ships to the other side of the world to bring back the necessities, to this country, or people had to go, on long trails with horses over mountain passes to get food from another region. But now, now we've mastered. Now we've got so many different forms of transport, so many different systems of communication and of delivering parcels all over the world just in a couple of days. Then this is not really relevant anymore. But actually, it's actually more relevant. But because we've created such an entangling web of karmic reactions that we're no longer able to see it in this graphic way. I would imagine that quite a few business people would be able to appreciate it, because they will actually, especially in times of war or in times of economic collapse, then most business people will become a little bit introspective and wonder whether all of their endeavors have actually been futile. However, but in general, even in like today's times, in times of impending climate disaster and in the middle of a pandemic, even now, governments are just thinking, how can they continue the same economic activity, global economic activity? How can it be maintained, or how can it be advanced? How can they use their technology to rectify the anomalies that have taken place in recent years? There's actually no recourse to spiritual solutions whatsoever. Although governments are perhaps approaching religious institutions and church leaders to assist them in their attempts to control the consumption of the public, they're not actually approaching them to ask for spiritual solutions. They just know that religious leaders have a lot of influence, and therefore they have to involve them in their attempts to control like the temporary necessity of reducing consumption. But no, this is actually like this description by Jad Bharat and by Shukadev Goswami and by Srila Prabhupada. This description is the topmost progressive understanding of material life, because it addresses the root. It addresses the root of the problem, which is applicable in all societies, whether technologically advanced or whether more reliant on the natural resources and the knowledge of how to use the natural resources. So it's also a warning to us that even if governments do adopt more ecologically grounded principles and take advice from environmentalists and from permaculture experts and even from devotees, perhaps, even in regarding how to adjust life according to more ecological principles. Even if they do that, still the tendencies of the living entities to become bewildered will still be there. And this tendency is described here from the Bhagavad Gita. Ahankara vimudatma kartahamiti manyate. A poor man is so absorbed in the thought of maintaining body and soul together that he forgets his original relationship with Krishna and seeks only the bodily comforts. So this word absorbed is very important. And then in the Sanskrit, in the verse, the word is abhinivesha, a person fully absorbed. And this word also appears in a verse from the 11th canto, in a conversation between Maharaj Nimi and the 9 Yugendras. And there, Maharaj Nimi is asking, how is it that the living entities perpetually become bewildered, even after so many, having gone through the school of hard knocks in business life, in family life, in political life? How is it that they continually fall into the same trap? So Maharaj Nimi receives the answer from in a verse which Srila Prabhupada quotes many, many times throughout his books and his lectures. Vayam dviti abhiniveshita syad isadapitasya viparyayo smriti. That when the living entity forgets his eternal relationship with Krishna and ceases to act in terms of that relationship, then he becomes absorbed in dvitiya bhine veshita. He becomes absorbed in a second nature, which basically means he becomes absorbed in the illusory energy of the Lord. And this creates bhayam, this creates great fear. So Krishna consciousness is a condition of complete absorption. Whenever we read about any pastimes of Krishna's pure devotees, whether in the spiritual world or in the material world, then we can understand that their lives and their mentality is completely different from ours. They are fully absorbed in Krishna. There's never any indication that they have to struggle to remain absorbed. They're fully absorbed. So this is the nature of Krishna consciousness. It is full absorption. And it's also, Srila Prabhupada describes, it's the nature of the mind. Vikalpa, sankalpa, accepting and rejecting. So the mind is the friend, the best friend of the living entity, and the enemy as well. For one whose mind is controlled, the mind is the best friend. For one whose mind is uncontrolled, the mind remains the greatest enemy. So when the mind is controlled, then complete absorption is possible. When the mind is not controlled, complete absorption is not possible. However, When the mind is not controlled, although complete absorption in one object or one person is not possible, but because the nature of the mind, the nature of the living entity is to be completely absorbed, then the living entity becomes completely absorbed in things other than Krishna, a great variety of things. And also the living entity becomes, it's described, due to lusty, Srila Prabhupada says in this purport, due to lusty desire, the living entity creates a certain mental situation whereby he wants to enjoy this material world. And so the living entity inhabits a mental space in which reality is purely obtaining his material desires. Because the main purpose of the human body and the human mind is to be fully absorbed in Krishna, then that constitutional nature of the human psyche is not, it doesn't disappear, but it's just reversed, and it's so the living entity creates this kind of intense absorption in this illusory position of being the enjoyer. Kataham iti manyate ahankara vimudatma. And even when the living entity becomes completely frustrated and attempts to follow the path of Jnana Yoga and lives a life of renunciation and rejects sense objects and rejects material contemplation, because the nature of the living entity is to be absorbed, then they can't maintain that situation of shunyavadi for long, and they again fall down into material conception. So those persons who've come in contact with the Guru Parampara, the acharyas who come from the spiritual world to enlighten us, and by studying their lives, like the life of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Gadadhar Pandit, Srila Prabhupada, and by reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, which describes the lives of other great sages over many previous yugas, then we can begin to understand our situation, and we will obviously take up the means of rectification, which is bhakti yoga. But it doesn't bring about the transformation immediately. We've become so absorbed in this illusory condition that we've created in our mind that we're afraid to leave it. We're afraid of losing out. We're afraid of pain and isolation. We're afraid of being cheated because we've been cheated so many thousands of times in thousands of lives by the material energy, and that it's like a subconscious fear that that if we try to go outside this paradigm, then we'll be cheated in some way. We may intellectually think, "Oh, I'm not afraid. I accept Srila Prabhupada. I accept the acharyas. I accept the Srimad Bhagavatam." But from our from our observing our own lives and observing our commitment to the path of Bhakti Yoga, we can understand that from time to time we just give up the endeavor, or we relax the endeavor. We don't want to go into that realm of challenging our very deeply rooted convictions that comfort and enjoyment, material comfort and material enjoyment, and are necessities. So Srila Prabhupada stresses over and over again in his purports that the means to revive the spiritual absorption, the absorption in Krishna, is by hearing and chanting about Krishna's activities, about the activities of Krishna's incarnations, especially Lord Chaitanya's activities, and to hear the prayers and read the books written by Krishna's devotees, and to accept a spiritual master who is a devotee of Krishna, who's fully absorbed in Krishna. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, in Srila Prabhupada's purport, it's actually in Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's commentary on that verse, Bhayam Dutiyam Abhineshitasyat, he says that we should accept a spiritual master who is Vrajanandana Prishta, who is very dear to Krishna. We should accept a spiritual master who is fully absorbed. So I'll stop there. Are there any questions or comments?
How do we become optimistic about spreading Krishna consciousness if people don't seem to be on the same page?
I was just listening to a disciple of Srila Prabhupada, Sankirtan Das, describing Srila Prabhupada's, saying that Srila Prabhupada wanted us to go into businesses and factories and tell the owners of the businesses and factories that if they read the Bhagavad Gita, then their work will improve. So, especially the Bhagavad Gita is the Bhagavad Gita is spoken by Krishna to Arjuna because he's a devotee, but also because he's a Kshatriya, because he's a political leader. And in our reading of Srila Prabhupada's pastimes, especially in India, you can see that he was always keen to speak to political leaders. Although Srila Prabhupada didn't compromise in terms of the philosophy, but he understood there was a need for spiritual leaders to become the guides of political and business leaders. Because the teachings of especially of the Bhagavad Gita, they're beneficial for people who are carrying out their spiritual duties, but also beneficial for people who are attempting to conscientiously carry out governmental duties and business duties in terms of providing the necessities for society. Just like here we read that sometimes the conditioned soul is absorbed in finding residential quarters or apartments and getting a supply of water and riches to maintain his body. So we don't think so much about that now, but that's basically because political leaders and business leaders have created a huge infrastructure in modern day society whereby getting water and having residential and business property is made available. But that thing doesn't just come about automatically. It comes about because people make a certain amount of self-sacrifice. So Srila Prabhupada recognized the self-sacrifice which is made by political leaders and by business leaders. And he would say, you know, he would flatter them, recognizing their austerities to do some good work. And then he would say, but all your austerities are basically not going to bring you anything. But if you read these books, then you'll benefit from them, and all of the people who you work with will benefit from them. So yeah, Srila Prabhupada was always thinking of different ways in which his teachings could, the teachings of the Vedas and his presentation of the Vedas could be injected into materialistic society. In terms of his loyalty and strict adherence to Shastra, he was extremely he couldn't be moved. He was had complete faith in Shabda Brahma, Shastra Praman, no room for interpretation. His qualification was that he just repeated as it is. But in terms of his developing ways to introduce that teaching into society, he was extremely liberal, extremely inventive. So we shouldn't mix the two. Lord Chaitanya was the greatest of bridge preachers. When he was in his tour of South India, he would always really respect whichever community he came into, whether they were Vaishnavas or whether they were worshippers of Lord Shiva or whether they were atheists or Buddhists. He would give respect, but he would never deviate from the presentation of Shastra, and he would often quote Shastra, the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Bhagavad Gita. So we can follow in the footsteps of our acharyas in this way, that we can adapt our preaching strategies, but not adapt the message. You've got lots of experience of how to introduce it to business people and how to introduce it to, just like now we're introducing through our various projects in the community here, through Food for Scotland, through community well-being, through yoga. All these kind of things were approved by our acharyas, by Lord Chaitanya and by Srila Prabhupada. But the purpose of all of these activities is to bring people to the point where they can hear, and because that hearing is so potent. So if we're achieving those objectives, then our preaching is successful, and it's just a matter of time. It's not even a matter of time; it's working right now. But we're not seeing the result. Because the result takes time. His Holiness Sri Brahma Swami Raj says that when going out on book distribution is to enable people to hear and chant about Krishna, pure Shabda Brahma, and that the result won't come probably for several lifetimes in the future, that the book distribution is essential to have a continuous injection of Krishna consciousness into the wider society. And then the other forms of preaching, they're to kind of pick up those people who've come to that level where they can enter into the association of devotees. So we can't judge it purely on material statistics, how effective it's being. It is effective. It is effective to distribute Srila Prabhupada's books. It is effective to enable people to hear the holy name. That is the success. Srila Prabhupada wanted to know how many books had been distributed. he wasn't asking, although he was also very happy that people were coming to the temple, but he was happy when his books were distributed. Rantra Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srila Prabhupada ki, Srila Satchidananda Thakur Bhaktivinoda ki, Srila Gadadhar Pandit ki, Anantakoti Vaishnavinda ki, Nitai Gaur Premanandi, Anantakoti Vaishnavinda ki Jai.